Wyoming Territory, 1885. The land was a study in stark and silent poetry, written in strokes of ochre dust and the deep, enduring green of pine. It was a place that did not offer comfort easily, but demanded respect, and in return, it offered a kind of brutal honesty that Caleb Thorne had come to value above all else. His ranch was nestled in a valley that cupped the last of the Laramie Mountains, a solitary outpost against the immense, unblinking sky. From his porch, he could see the world laid out before him, a world he had deliberately made small and manageable. The wind, a constant companion, whispered through the cottonwoods that lined the creek, carrying the scent of sage and distant rain that would likely never fall here. It was a lonely sound, but it was a familiar loneliness, one he had curated like a garden, weeding out anything that threatened its sterile order. Caleb ran a calloused hand over the smooth, worn wood of the porch railing. He had built this house himself, timber by timber, nail by nail, after the fever had come and swept away the life he had built before. That other life felt like a story told about another man. He could recall fragments of it, like shards of sun-bleached glass found in the dirt. The weight of a small, trusting hand in his, the echo of a woman's laughter that sounded like wind chimes in a summer breeze. But the memories were dangerous. They were seeds of a pain that, if allowed to sprout, would grow into a thorny vine and choke the life he had so carefully reconstructed. So he kept them buried deep under layers of hard work and self-imposed silence. His philosophy was simple, forged in the crucible of loss. A man survived alone. Attachments were anchors that could drag you down into the depths, and he had no intention of ever drowning again. His world consisted of the rising sun, the needs of his cattle, the setting sun, and the quiet of his own company. Martha, a widow whose pragmatic kindness was as steady as the mountains themselves, came up from town twice a week to manage the house, but their conversations were clipped and practical, orbiting around supplies and repairs. She knew his story, and she respected the walls he had built around his heart, never trying to breach them. He was a man defined by his perimeter, by the fences that kept his cattle in and the world out. A sound, thin and sharp, cut through the afternoon stillness. It was the whistle of the weekly train, a metallic cry from the world beyond his valley. It was a sound he usually ignored, a mere punctuation mark in the long, rambling sentence of his week. It meant mail he rarely received and supplies he could fetch from town at his own leisure. But today, for a reason he could not name, the sound felt different. It was not a punctuation mark, but an interruption, a crack in the placid surface of his solitude. A faint unease stirred within him, a feeling like the air gets just before a storm, heavy and charged. He dismissed it as foolishness, a trick of the wind. He needed a ride into Redemption Creek for salt licks and flour anyway. He grabbed his hat, settled it low on his brow, and moved toward the barn, his long-legged stride eating up the dusty ground. The train whistle faded, but the echo of it remained, a dissonant note in the quiet symphony of his life. The train itself was a great, black beast, hissing steam and groaning to a halt at the small wooden platform that served as Redemption Creek Station. It exhaled a cloud of soot and smoke that momentarily hazed the brilliant blue of the sky. From within its stuffy, velvet-lined confines, Elara Hayes took a deep, steadying breath, the air tasting of cold dust and her own nervous anticipation. She smoothed the skirt of her navy blue traveling dress for the 10th time, the fabric feeling impossibly fine and out of place against the raw, splintered wood of the carriage. For weeks, this moment had been a beacon of hope, the culmination of a desperate gamble. The letter from Mr. Blackwood was tucked safely in her reticule, its promises of a position as the town's new schoolteacher a lifeline she had clung to with all her might. As she stepped down onto the platform, the sheer scale of the landscape struck her with physical force. Boston, with its narrow streets and tall, familiar buildings, was a world away. Here, the sky was an endless, overwhelming canvas, and the horizon was a distant, jagged line that seemed to go on forever. The town of Redemption Creek was little more than a single, wide street carved from the dust, flanked by a collection of weathered, false-fronted buildings. It was smaller, rougher than she had imagined. A gust of wind, hot and dry, swirled around her, lifting a fine layer of grit that settled on her face and clothes. She felt a sudden, sharp pang of vulnerability, a feeling of being terribly and conspicuously alone. Her honey-blonde hair, carefully pinned, felt the tug of the wind, and she pressed a hand to it, as if she could hold herself together by sheer will. She scanned the small crowd on the platform. A few rough-looking men in dusty hats, a woman with a crying baby, the station master with his weary, kind eyes. There was no sign of the distinguished, silver-haired Mr. Blackwood she had pictured from his eloquent letters. A knot of anxiety tightened in her stomach, but she pushed it down. He was likely just delayed. She would be patient. She was good at being patient. It was a skill honed by years of quiet observation in her father's library, of waiting for a life that seemed to always be just beyond her reach. Caleb Thorne had tied his horse outside the general store and was negotiating the price of oats with Miller, the proprietor, when he saw her. She stood on the station platform, a solitary figure of deep blue against the washed-out browns and grays of the town. She was like a character who had wandered out of the wrong book and onto this dusty, unforgiving stage. He saw the fine cut of her dress, the hopeful tilt of her chin, and the subtle tremor of apprehension in the way she clutched her small leather valise. He saw, with the practiced eye of a man who understood this land's predators, that she was prey, not for wolves or mountain lions, but for the human sort that thrived on the innocence of newcomers. He turned back to his business, a familiar gruffness settling over him. It was not his concern. He had his own world to manage, his own ghost to keep at bay. Yet, his gaze kept drifting back to her. He watched as she spoke to Jed, the station master, her expression shifting from hopeful inquiry to confusion and then to a carefully masked panic. He saw Jed shake his head, his shoulders slumping with a kind of weary pity. Caleb knew, even before he heard the story, what had happened. It was a cruel trick played more than once. A man in the East luring a desperate woman west with false promises, only to abandon her upon arrival, or worse. As if on cue, the wind rose again, a sudden, violent gust that tore through the street like a living thing. It kicked up a blinding cloud of dust that swirled like golden phantoms. Alara, caught off guard, took an involuntary step back. Her heel caught on an uneven plank, and she stumbled, her valise slipping from her grasp and spilling its modest contents onto the dusty platform. A book, a silver-backed brush, a small packet of letters tied with a ribbon. The intimate architecture of her life, now scattered in the dirt. Caleb moved before he had consciously decided to. It was an instinct, old and deeply buried, the same instinct that made him pull a newborn calf from a mire or stand between his herd and a predator. He crossed the distance in a few long strides, his boots solid on the ground while she seemed about to be swept away. He reached her just as she lost her balance completely, his hand closing around her elbow, steadying her. The contact was a jolt, a spark of warmth and solid strength that traveled up her arm. Her eyes, the color of a summer sky just before a storm, widened as she looked up at him. For a moment, they were frozen in that tableau, his large, calloused hand holding her arm, the wind whipping a strand of her honey-blonde hair across his weathered cheek, the dust settling around them like a shroud. He was tall, his shoulders broad under a simple chambray shirt, his face carved with lines that spoke of sun and hardship, not unkindness. His eyes were a deep, guarded gray, like a winter river. "Are you all right, miss?" His voice was low and rough, like stones rolling in a creek bed. Alara found her breath, mortified by her clumsiness and profoundly grateful for his steadying presence. "Yes, thank you. I am quite all right." She pulled her arm back, the warmth of his touch lingering on her skin. She knelt to gather her scattered belongings, her cheeks flushing with color. He knelt opposite her, his movements economical and sure. He picked up the book, a volume of poetry by Keats, and handed it to her, his fingers brushing hers. "Another small shock. You were looking for someone," he stated. It was not a question. Yes, she said, her voice a little breathless as she tucked the book back into her valise. Mr. Blackwood. He offered me a position. To be the school teacher. Caleb's expression did not change, but a muscle tightened in his jaw. He had been right. There is no Mr. Blackwood in Redemption Creek, he said, his tone flat, leaving no room for argument or false hope. Never has been. The words landed like stones, each one shattering a piece of the fragile hope she had carried all the way from Boston. The blood drained from her face, leaving her pale and suddenly fragile looking beneath the harsh Wyoming sun. He saw the fight in her to remain composed, the squaring of her shoulders, the determined lift of her chin, and he felt an unwelcome and dangerous flicker of admiration. She was a long way from home, with nothing but a book of poems and a lie to her name, and still she did not crumble. Sheriff Brody, a man whose belly strained the buttons of his vest and whose face was a roadmap of good-natured worry, ambled over, drawn by the small scene. Jed the station master joined him, wringing his hands. It is just as I told her, Caleb, Jed said, his voice full of apology. A cruel hoax. It seems, what am I to do? Alara's voice was quiet, but it held a core of steel that surprised Caleb. She was asking for information, not pity. Well now, Sheriff Brody began, scratching his chin. The hotel is full up with drovers from the bar T. Not a fit place for a lady. And the next train east is not for another week. He looked from Alara's distressed face to Caleb's impassive one, an idea dawning. It was then that Martha, Caleb's housekeeper, emerged from the general store, her basket laden with supplies. She was a woman whose face was as kind as it was weathered, her eyes missing nothing. She took in the scene at a glance. The stranded Eastern lady, the concerned sheriff, and her employer, who looked as though he would rather be wrestling a bear than standing in this particular circle of humanity. She has nowhere to stay. Martha's question was directed at the sheriff, but her eyes were on Caleb. Not a safe place, no, Brody confirmed. Martha looked at Alara, a wave of maternal sympathy softening her features. Then she turned back to Caleb, her gaze firm. She can stay with us at the ranch. There is a spare room. It would not be proper for her to stay in town alone. A protest rose in Caleb's throat. His home was his sanctuary, his fortress of solitude. The idea of this woman, this stranger from another world, with her scent of lavender and her book of poems, invading that space was unthinkable. It was a disruption of the highest order. He opened his mouth to refuse, to say it was impossible, that it was not his problem. But then he looked at Alara. He saw the flicker of fear in her eyes, a fear she was trying so desperately to hide behind a mask of poise and dignity. He saw the dust on her fine dress and the exhaustion etched around her mouth. And he remembered another woman, long ago, who had looked at him with that same mixture of hope and fear when she first arrived in this unforgiving land. The refusal died on his lips, replaced by a sense of grim, unavoidable duty. To leave her here would be an act of cruelty he could not stomach, a betrayal of a code of honor he did not even realize he still possessed. Fine, he said, the word clipped and grudging. He turned to Alara, his gaze direct. You can stay at my ranch until the next train arrives. My housekeeper, Martha, will be there. You will be safe. He did not offer comfort or welcome, merely a statement of fact. For Caleb Thorne, safety was the only currency that mattered. The wagon ride to the ranch was a journey through a landscape of profound silence. The only sounds were the rhythmic clop of the horse's hooves, the creak of the wagon wheels turning through the dust, and the whisper of the wind as it combed through the tall, dry grass. Alara sat on the hard wooden bench beside Caleb, her hands folded primly in her lap, her back straight. She had expected to feel terror or despair, but instead, a strange sense of calm had settled over her. The foundation of her plans had crumbled to dust, leaving her standing on the bare, uncertain ground of the present moment. There was a peculiar freedom in it. She watched the land unfurl around them, a panorama of breathtaking scale and stark beauty. The mountains in the distance were purple shadows against the setting sun, and the vast plains seemed to glow with an inner golden light. It was not the gentle, tamed beauty of New England. This was something wilder, more primal, and it called to a part of her she had never known existed. Caleb, for his part, drove the team with a practiced, easy hand, his attention seemingly fixed on the trail ahead. But he was acutely aware of the woman beside him. He could feel the warmth of her presence, a subtle disturbance in the air. He had expected tears, or perhaps a barrage of nervous questions. He had received neither. She was quiet, observant, and possessed a stillness that he found both unnerving and compelling. He glanced at her from the corner of his eye. The setting sun caught the honey-gold strands of her hair, turning them to fire. Her profile was clean and strong, her gaze fixed on the horizon as if she were trying to read its secrets. She did not look like a woman defeated by circumstance. She looked like a traveler who had simply arrived at an unexpected destination. This resilience, this quiet refusal to break, chipped another small piece from the ice around his heart. Martha, who rode in the back of the wagon amongst the supplies, occasionally offered a gentle observation about a landmark or a type of wildflower, her voice a comforting thread in the vast tapestry of silence. It was she who broke the long quiet as they finally turned onto the track leading to the ranch house. "It is not much, Miss Hayes," she said apologetically, "but it is clean and sturdy. Please call me Alara," she replied, her voice clear and steady. "And I'm sure is wonderful. I'm grateful for your kindness. More than I can say. The house, when it came into view, was just as Martha had described it, a simple, sturdy log structure, built to withstand the elements, not to charm the eye. A plume of smoke curled from its stone chimney, a welcome sign of life in the encroaching twilight. It was a masculine space, functional and unadorned, yet Martha's touch was evident in the clean-swept porch and the pot of resilient geraniums by the door. Caleb pulled the wagon to a halt and jumped down, his movements fluid and efficient. He turned to help Alara, his hands going to her waist to lift her down. For the second time that day, they were in close contact. He was solid and warm, smelling of leather, dust, and pine. She was lighter than he expected, and for a fleeting moment, he felt a powerful, instinctual urge to protect her from all the harshness this land could muster. He set her down quickly, stepping back as if burned, retreating behind his wall of gruff silence. Martha showed Alara to the spare room. It was small and simply furnished with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single wooden chair. But the quilt on the bed was a colorful patchwork, and the small window looked out onto the vast, star-dusted expanse of the night sky. It was the safest she had felt in months. The first dinner was a stiff and awkward affair. They sat at a large wooden table in the main room, the flickering light of an oil lamp casting long shadows on the walls. Martha served a simple but hearty stew, and the silence was broken only by the clinking of spoons against pottery. Caleb ate with a grim focus, his presence filling the room, making it feel both smaller and safer. Alara, determined not to be an idle guest, tried to initiate conversation. "Your ranch is very beautiful, Mr. Thorne," she began, her voice sounding overly formal in the quiet room. "The valley is magnificent." He looked up, his gray eyes unreadable in the lamplight. "It is functional," he replied, his tone discouraging further comment. Undeterred, she tried again. "What do you raise here?" "Cattle." "Cattle," he confirmed, taking a piece of bread and mopping his bowl clean. The conversation withered and died. Alara fell silent, realizing that this man's quiet was not an absence of words, but a presence, a heavy blanket he wrapped around himself. She would not try to pull it away. She would simply have to get used to its weight. The days that followed fell into a strange, quiet rhythm. Alara, true to her word, refused to be idle. She insisted on helping Martha with the chores, her nimble fingers, accustomed to turning the pages of books, quickly learning the art of kneading dough, mending shirts, and tending the small vegetable garden behind the house. She was a quick study, and her cheerful determination was a quiet challenge to the somber atmosphere of the ranch. Caleb watched her from a distance. He saw her talking to his horses, her voice low and soothing. He He saw her sitting on the porch in the evenings, her book open in her lap, her face tilted up to watch the spectacular blaze of the Wyoming sunset. She was not the fragile city creature he had first judged her to be. There was a core of strength in her, a resilience that was as profound and quiet as the land itself. He found himself changing his routines, manufacturing reasons to be near the house when he would normally be out on the range. He told himself it was to ensure she did not wander off and get into trouble. But he knew, in a part of his soul he kept locked away, that it was because her presence was like a single, clear note of music in a house that had been silent for too long. He began to talk more, not much, but enough. He would answer her questions about the land, explaining the names of the wildflowers she picked, or the habits of the hawk that circled high above the valley. One evening, a few days before the train was due to return, a chill wind swept down from the mountains, bringing with it the promise of an early autumn. Martha had gone to bed, leaving Caleb and Alara alone in the main room, seated in 2 chairs before the crackling fire in the great stone hearth. The flames danced and leaped, casting a warm, intimate glow that seemed to push back the vast darkness outside. For a long while, they sat in a comfortable silence, watching the fire. "My father had a library filled with books," Alara said suddenly, her voice soft and reflective. "He was a professor. After he and my mother passed from influenza, the books were all I had left of them. I suppose that is why I thought being a schoolteacher would be a fitting life." Caleb turned to look at her. The firelight softened the lines of her face, making her look younger, more vulnerable. He saw the flicker of old grief in her eyes, a pain he recognized as his own. "You were an orphan then," he stated quietly. She nodded, her gaze returning to the flames. "There was nothing left for me in Boston. No family. The letters from Mr. Blackwood felt like a miracle. A chance to start anew, to be useful." She gave a small, sad smile. "It seems I was rather naive." The quiet honesty of her confession worked on him, loosening a stone in the wall he had built around his own past. He found himself speaking, the words coming out low and rough, as if dredged up from a deep, forgotten well. "This land," he began, his voice hoarse. "It gives you a sense of a new beginning. But it takes two. It takes more than it gives sometimes." He paused, staring into the heart of the fire, seeing other images there. "I had a wife, Sarah. She came here from Ohio. She loved the wildflowers in the spring." His voice caught for a moment. "We had a son, Daniel." He had his mother's smile. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of unspoken tragedy. "What happened to them?" Alara asked, her voice barely a whisper, full of a gentle compassion that did not demand an answer, but offered solace if he chose to give it. "A fever," he said, the words stark and brutal. "It swept through the valley 5 years ago. It took them both within a week. I built this house for them. For our future." He looked around the room, at the sturdy walls that had become his prison. "After they were gone, I buried them up on that ridge." He gestured vaguely toward the window. "And I buried myself here, in that moment. They were not a hardened rancher and a stranded Eastern lady. They were simply 2 people, bound by the common, universal language of loss." Alara felt tears well in her eyes, not of pity, but of a profound, aching empathy. She saw him then, truly saw him, not as the stoic, silent man who ran this ranch, but as a man hollowed out by a grief so immense it had reshaped his entire world. Without thinking, she reached out and placed her hand on his arm. It was a simple, instinctive gesture of comfort. He did not pull away. He looked down at her small, soft hand on his rough, weathered sleeve. He felt the warmth of her touch seep through the fabric, a warmth that reached a place inside him that had been cold for 5 long years. He looked up and met her gaze. Her eyes were shining with unshed tears, but what he saw in them was not pity. It was understanding. It was a shared humanity. For the first time since Sarah's death, Caleb Thorne did not feel entirely alone. A bond, fragile but true, had been forged between them in the flickering firelight, a quiet acknowledgement of the scars they both carried. He had started to see her strength, her resilience. And she, in turn, had seen the honorable, wounded heart that beat beneath his gruff and silent exterior. The fragile peace of their shared understanding was shattered 3 days later by the arrival of 3 riders. Caleb was repairing a harness in the barn when he heard the drumming of hooves. He straightened up, his senses instantly on high alert. Riders did not come to his ranch uninvited. He stepped to the barn door, his hand resting instinctively on the hilt of the pistol he always wore at his hip. The man in the lead was Silas Croft. He was a man who looked soft and prosperous in his tailored city coat, but his eyes were as hard and cold as river stones. Croft owned the sprawling Box C ranch that bordered Caleb's land to the south, and he had a reputation for getting what he wanted by whatever means necessary. The 2 men with him were of a different sort entirely: lean, hard-faced men with the watchful, predatory stillness of hired guns. From a window in the house, where she was helping Martha fold laundry, Alara saw them too. A knot of apprehension tightened in her stomach. There was an air of menace about the visitors that was as palpable as the dust their horses kicked up. Croft reined in his horse a few yards from where Caleb stood. He smiled, a thin, unpleasant expression that did not reach his eyes. "Thorn," he said, his voice smooth and condescending. "I was in the area. Thought I would stop by and repeat my offer." "My answer is the same, Croft," Caleb said, his voice level and cold. "This land is not for sale." Croft's smile tightened. "Everything is for sale for the right price. Your spread is modest, but it has one very valuable asset." He gestured vaguely toward the line of cottonwoods that marked the creek. "That water. It is the only reliable source in this valley, and my herd is growing. I am prepared to be generous. More than generous. In fact, considering your circumstances, the implication was clear. A lone man like Caleb could not hope to hold out against a man with Croft's resources." "I have all the water I need," Caleb replied, his stance unwavering. "And my circumstances are my own. Now, if you have no other business, you are on private property." Croft's gaze flickered past Caleb, toward the house. He had seen the flutter of a curtain at the window. "I hear you have company," he said, his voice taking on a suggestive, oily tone. "An Eastern lady, they say in town. It must get lonely out here. A man needs companionship. Perhaps you're thinking of expanding your family, not just your herd. That would require more capital." A cold, dangerous anger began to build in Caleb's chest. The mention of Alara, the way Croft's eyes had lingered on the house, was a violation. It was a threat. "My company is not your concern," Caleb said, his voice dropping to a low growl. "And this conversation is over. Get off my land." For a long moment, the 2 men locked gazes. A silent battle of wills waged across the dusty yard. Croft's men shifted in their saddles, their hands hovering near their guns. Finally, Croft gave a short, humorless laugh. "Have it your way, Thorn, but a wise man knows when to cut his losses. Think about it." He wheeled his horse around, and the 3 men rode off, leaving a trail of dust and unspoken menace in their wake. Inside the house, Alara let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. She had heard every word. "Who was that man?" she asked Martha, her voice trembling slightly. "Silas Croft," Martha said, her lips a thin, grim line. "A vulture in a fine coat. He's been trying to get his hands on this ranch for years, ever since he found out how deep Caleb's creek runs, even in the dry season. He is a greedy, dangerous man." The threat did not remain veiled for long. 2 mornings later, Caleb rode out to check on his herd and found a long section of his northern fence cut. The wires were snipped clean, the posts kicked down. A dozen head of cattle had wandered out onto the open range, and it took him the better part of the day to round them up. It was a message, a petty act of vandalism designed to be an inconvenience, a reminder of his vulnerability. A few days after that, the confrontation became more direct. Caleb was riding the creek line, checking for any signs of tampering with his water source, when he was intercepted by one of Croft's men. It was the taller of the 2, a man with a cruel mouth and empty eyes whose name he had heard was Pike. "You are a long way from your own property," Caleb said, reining in his horse, his hand resting casually on his thigh, inches from his pistol. "Just admiring the scenery." Pike sneered, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the clear water of the creek. The act was a deliberate desecration. Mr. Croft, he is a man who does not like to be told no. He finds it impolite. He sent me to ask you to reconsider his offer. Tell Mr. Croft my answer stands, Caleb said, his voice dangerously quiet. And tell him if I find any of his men on my land again, I will consider it trespassing with intent to do harm. And I will respond accordingly. Pike's eyes narrowed, but he saw the unyielding resolve in Caleb's face. He knew this was not a man who made idle threats. With a final, contemptuous sneer, he turned his horse and rode away. Caleb watched him go, a cold certainty settling in his gut. This was not over. Croft was testing him, pushing him, looking for a weakness to exploit. And Caleb knew, with a sudden, chilling clarity, that Croft had likely identified the one new weakness he had, the woman in his house. The thought was a spur that sent a jolt of fear through him, a fear more potent than any he had ever felt for himself. Elara. She had become a part of the quiet rhythm of his days, her presence a source of unexpected light. The idea of her being used as a pawn in Croft's greedy game was unbearable. He had to protect her. He had to keep her safe. The thought consumed him, becoming the single, driving focus of his existence. Elara, meanwhile, was growing increasingly frustrated with her own perceived uselessness. While she was grateful for Caleb's protection, she was not accustomed to being idle or sheltered. She wanted to contribute, to prove that she was not a burden. An idea took root. She would take Caleb his midday meal, just as she had seen farm wives do in the illustrations of the book she had read. It was a small gesture, but it felt important. She packed a lunch of bread, cheese, and dried apples into a saddlebag, ignoring Martha's gentle protestations that Caleb was perfectly capable of feeding himself. He is checking the fences along the canyon rim, Martha told her, pointing westward. Just follow the creek. You cannot miss it. Feeling a sense of purpose she had not felt in weeks, Elara saddled one of the gentler mares, a sweet-tempered buckskin named Daisy. The ride was exhilarating. The air was crisp and clean, and the sun was warm on her back. The vastness of the landscape, which had once seemed so intimidating, now felt liberating. She followed the creek as Martha had instructed, but as the terrain grew rougher, the trail seemed to split and fork. Unsure which path to take, she chose the one that seemed to lead upward toward the rugged canyon walls. Within half an hour, she knew she was lost. The creek was no longer in sight, and the landscape had become a confusing maze of rocky outcrops and steep, brush-choked gullies. A flicker of fear, cold and sharp, pierced her confidence. She was about to turn the mare back when two riders emerged from behind a tall formation of red rock, blocking her path. It was Pike and the other hired gun from Croft's ranch. "Well, look what we have here," Pike said, his lips curling into a predatory smile. The little eastern bird has flown from her cage. Elara's heart hammered against her ribs, but she kept her chin high. "I'm looking for Mr. Thorne's property," she said, her voice commendably steady. "I seem to have lost my way. You are on Mr. Thorne's property, all right." The second man chuckled a nasty, grating sound. "But he's a long way from here. It is just us." They moved their horses closer, penning her in. Pike reached out and grabbed Daisy's reins, his knuckles brushing Elara's hand. She flinched back as if she had been burned. "Let go of my horse," she demanded, her voice rising. "Now, there is no need to get upset, Missy," Pike said, his eyes roaming over her in a way that made her skin crawl. "We are not going to hurt you. We just want to send a message to your stubborn friend Thorne. He seems to think this land is more important than, say, your well-being. We are here to help him reconsider his priorities." The terror that had been flickering within her ignited into a blaze. She knew with absolute certainty that these men, while perhaps not intending to kill her, meant to terrorize her, to use her as a weapon against Caleb. Her mind raced, searching for an escape. She was trapped. Just as Pike began to dismount, a voice cold and deadly as a winter wind cut through the air. "Take your hand off that horse." All three of them turned. Caleb was there, not 50 yards away, atop his powerful black stallion. He had not appeared. He had simply materialized, a figure of righteous fury against the backdrop of the red rocks. He held a rifle in his hands, and it was aimed squarely at Pike's chest. He had been tracking her, a knot of dread growing in his stomach with every minute she was overdue. When he had seen the tracks of 2 other horses join hers, that dread had turned to ice-cold rage. Pike's hand dropped from the reins, as if they were red-hot iron. "Now, Thorn," he stammered, his bravado evaporating. "This is just a misunderstanding, the only misunderstanding," Caleb said, his voice dangerously low as he urged his horse forward, "is that you thought you would live to see sunset if you laid a hand on her. Drop your gun belts." Slowly, the 2 men, seeing the utter lack of mercy in Caleb's eyes, did as they were told. Their pistols thumped into the dust. The rescue was swift, brutal, and utterly efficient. Caleb dismounted, never taking his eyes off them, and motioned for Alara to move behind him. He kicked their guns away and then delivered a final, chilling warning. "Ride back to Croft. Tell him this is his only warning. If I ever see either of you on my land, or anywhere near her, again, I will not be so courteous. I will put you in the ground. Do you understand me?" They nodded, their faces pale with fear. "Now get out of my sight." They scrambled onto their horses and fled, riding as if the devil himself were on their heels. Caleb watched them go, his rifle still held at the ready. Only when they were out of sight did he finally lower it. He turned to Alara, and the look on his face made her breath catch in her throat. The cold fury was gone, replaced by a raw, naked terror that he could not conceal. He strode toward her and grabbed her by the upper arms, his grip firm but not painful. He was checking her for injury, his eyes scanning her face, her dress, as if searching for any sign that they had harmed her. The proximity was overwhelming, his fear a palpable heat between them. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his voice hoarse. "No, Caleb, I'm fine." "You came just in time," she whispered, her body trembling with the aftermath of her fear. He let out a shuddering breath, his forehead resting against hers for a brief, unguarded moment. Then he pulled back, and the walls slammed back into place. The fear in his eyes was replaced by a grim, unyielding resolve. "You should not have come out here alone," he said, his voice flat and cold. The intimacy of the moment was shattered, leaving her feeling suddenly chilled. He was not looking at her, but through her, his mind already miles away, calculating threats and planning defenses. The rescue was complete, but in its wake, a new and more painful distance had opened between them. The ride back to the ranch was thick with a tense, suffocating silence. The terror of Alara's encounter had been replaced by the chilling cold of Caleb's withdrawal. He rode slightly ahead of her, his back a rigid wall of disapproval. The protective fury he had displayed in the canyon was gone, supplanted by a remote, impenetrable stoicism. Every word he had not said screamed at her. She was a liability, a foolish woman who had put them all in danger. By the time they reached the familiar sight of the barn and house, a miserable certainty had settled in her heart. He regretted ever letting her stay. That evening, after a dinner so quiet the scrape of a fork on a plate sounded like a thunderclap, Caleb finally spoke. He did not look at her, but stared into the fire, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles were white. "The train comes through Redemption Creek tomorrow afternoon," he said, his voice devoid of all emotion. "I will take you into town myself." The words, though expected, were a physical blow. Alara felt the air leave her lungs. "You are sending me away," she stated, her voice a hollow whisper. "It is not safe for you here," he said, the words clipped and final. "Croft knows you are here. He will use you to get to me. I cannot protect you if you are wandering off into canyons." The accusation in his tone, though subtle, was unmistakable. Pain, sharp and swift, lanced through her, followed by a surge of angry pride. He saw her as the cause of the problem, a weakness to be excised. He did not see the woman who had tried to help, the woman who was falling in love with him. He saw a damsel in distress, a fragile piece of porcelain that he could not afford to have around. "So that is what I am to you?" she challenged, her voice trembling with a mixture of hurt and indignation. "A liability? A burden you must be rid of for your own safety?" He finally turned to look at her, and his gray eyes were filled with a torment that stunned her. "You are a distraction I cannot afford," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he was desperately trying to suppress. "My life was simple before you came here. I had my work. I had my solitude. I was safe and lonely," she shot back, standing up to face him, her hands clenched in a fist at her sides. "You were living in a tomb of your own making, Caleb Thorne. Do not blame me for letting a little light in. That light is what attracts the wolves," he exploded, rising to his feet as well, his much larger frame towering over her. The room crackled with the force of his anguish. "I will not let what happened to Sarah and Daniel happen to you. I will not stand by and watch this land take someone else I care about. Do you understand? Sending you away is the only way I can be sure you will be safe." It was a confession, she realized, buried under layers of anger and fear. He was not pushing her away because he thought she was a burden, but because he cared for her. The realization did little to soothe the sting of his decision. He was sacrificing their burgeoning connection on the altar of his past trauma. He was choosing his ghosts over her. "You think I am weak," she said, her voice dropping, thick with unshed tears. "You see a woman from the city who needs a man to rescue her. But you are wrong. I am not some porcelain doll to be shattered, Caleb. I am stronger than you think." Her heart broke with the injustice of it. He had seen her resilience, her adaptability, but when faced with real danger, he had defaulted to seeing her as a fragile thing in need of saving. Without another word, she turned and fled to her room, the sound of a sob finally escaping her lips as she closed the door behind her. Caleb stood alone by the fire, the echo of her words, "I am stronger than you think," haunting him. He sank back into his chair, the picture of a man who had won the battle but lost the war. He had done what he believed was necessary to protect her, but in doing so, he had wounded her more deeply than any of Croft's thugs ever could. He had broken her heart, and in the process, he had shattered his own. The night was long and suffocatingly quiet. Sleep offered no escape for either of them. Alara lay awake, staring into the darkness, her heart a leaden weight in her chest. She packed her small valise with methodical, heartbreaking slowness, each folded garment a final farewell. Caleb sat by the dying embers of the fire, his rifle across his lap, his mind a battlefield of regret and fear. The attack came just before dawn, in that gray, spectral hour when the world holds its breath. It began not with a shout, but with a sudden, unnatural bloom of orange light against the dark windows. Fire. A wave of acrid smoke seeped under the door. The barn. The cry was torn from Caleb's throat as he leaped to his feet. It was a diversion. He knew it instantly. A classic tactic to draw him out. He grabbed his second rifle from the rack by the door just as the first gunshot shattered the front window, sending a spray of glass across the wooden floor. "Get down," he yelled, shoving the rifle into Martha's hands as she emerged, terrified, from her room. The root cellar. "Now!" He pushed the older woman toward the trapdoor in the kitchen floor. He turned to find Alara standing in the doorway of her room, her face pale, but her eyes wide and alert, not with panic, but with a fierce, focused intensity. "Alara, get in the cellar with Martha." "No," she said, her voice clear and steady over the sound of another gunshot. "I am not hiding." Before he could argue, one of Croft's men kicked open the back door. It was Pike, his face twisted in a malicious grin. Caleb swung his rifle around, but another man, firing from the side of the house, forced him to take cover behind the heavy wooden table he had overturned. The house was a death trap, caught in a crossfire. Pike advanced into the kitchen, his pistol raised, intending to flank Caleb. He did not see Alara. He did not register her as a threat. It was a fatal miscalculation. With a cry that was part fear and part fury, Alara seized the heavy cast-iron skillet from the stove where Martha had left it the night before. It was heavy, unwieldy, but her adrenaline-fueled strength was more than enough. As Pike stepped past her, she swung it with all her might, a desperate, two-handed blow that connected with the side of his head with a sickening thud. Pike grunted, his eyes rolling back in his head as he staggered sideways, stunned and disoriented. The shot he fired went wild, burying itself in the ceiling. The opening was all Caleb needed. He rose from behind the table and brought the butt of his rifle down on Pike's shoulder, sending the man crashing to the floor, his pistol skittering away into a corner. Caleb stared at Alara for a fraction of a second, his mind reeling. Her hair had come loose from its pins, her face was smudged with soot, and in her hands she held the skillet like a shield. She had not hidden. She had fought. She was magnificent. The moment was broken by the crash of the front door being kicked in. Silas Croft himself stood there, a revolver in his hand, a look of triumphant greed on his face. "It is over, Thorne. The ranch is mine." Behind him, his last remaining thug provided cover. The gunfight became a desperate, close-quarters struggle. Caleb was a formidable opponent, his movements honed by war and a lifetime of frontier survival. He exchanged fire with Croft's man, driving him back out the door. But in doing so, he exposed his side to Croft. Croft fired, and a searing pain exploded in Caleb's left arm. He stumbled back, his rifle clattering to the floor as his arm went numb. Croft advanced on him, his pistol aimed at Caleb's heart. "I will take your land, your water, and maybe," he sneered, his gaze sliding to Alara. "I will take your woman, too." She is spirit, seeing Alara in Croft's leering sights. Something inside Caleb, some final, carefully constructed wall, shattered into a million pieces. The fear of losing her was a roaring inferno that consumed everything else, his past, his pain, his belief in solitude. "Leave her out of this, Croft," he snarled, launching himself forward, ignoring the fire in his arm. He slammed into Croft, and the two men went down in a desperate tangle of limbs. Croft's pistol fired again, the bullet tearing a splintered groove in the floorboards. In the struggle, the gun was knocked from Croft's hand, sliding across the floor and coming to rest near the hearth. Alara did not hesitate. While Croft's other man was momentarily distracted by the fight, she scrambled for Caleb's fallen rifle. It was heavy and unfamiliar in her hands. Her fingers trembled as she fumbled with the stock and barrel. She had never fired a gun in her life. She took a deep breath, the smell of gunpowder sharp in her nostrils. She remembered Caleb showing her, almost casually, how it worked just days before. Sight down the barrel. Squeeze, do not pull. The remaining thug, seeing her with the weapon, turned his attention to her, raising his own pistol. He saw an easy target, but the woman he saw was not the woman who had arrived a week ago. Her eyes were steady, blazing with a courage she had not known she possessed. She raised the heavy rifle, pointing it directly at the man's chest. "Get out," she said, her voice ringing with an authority that stunned him into a moment's hesitation. "Get out of this house now." Her unexpected defiance created the opening Caleb needed. He landed a solid punch to Croft's jaw, dazing him. He surged to his feet, grabbed the stunned land baron, and used him as a shield, shoving him toward the door. "It is over," Caleb roared. The last thug, seeing his employer captured and a determined woman with a rifle aimed at his heart, lost his nerve. He turned and fled into the pre-dawn gloom. With the immediate threat gone, Caleb shoved Croft onto the porch, his good hand pressing the man's face against a post. The adrenaline began to fade, and a wave of dizziness washed over him from the pain in his arm. He stumbled back into the room, leaning heavily against the doorframe. His eyes found Alara. She was still standing there, holding the rifle, her knuckles white. She looked at him, at the blood soaking his sleeve, and a look of anguish crossed her face. The rifle suddenly seemed too heavy, and she let it slide to the floor. They stared at each other across the smoky, debris-strewn room, the silence roaring in their ears. He lurched toward her, his wound forgotten. He pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her hair, which smelled of smoke and her own unique scent. He held her as if he could absorb her into himself, as if he could weld them together so they could never be separated. "I thought I'd lost you," he breathed, his voice ragged with emotion. The words he had kept locked away for 5 years, the feelings he had denied and fought against, came pouring out. "I was a fool, a blind, stubborn fool, sending you away. It would not have kept you safe. It would have just been another way of losing you." It would be like tearing out my own heart. He pulled back just enough to look in her eyes, his own gray eyes shining with a fierce, desperate light. I love you, Alara. I love your courage and your kindness and the way you see the world. Do not leave. Please, stay here. Build a life with me. It was not a plea. It was a prayer offered up from the ruins of his solitude in the smoky dawn of a new day. The sound of approaching horses and shouting men finally broke the spell. Sheriff Brody, alerted by a neighboring rancher who had seen the fire and heard the gunshots, arrived with a posse of half a dozen men. They found a scene of controlled chaos, a barn burning fiercely, a dazed Silas Croft tied to his own saddle, a subdued Pike nursing a massive lump on his head, and Caleb Thorne, bleeding but defiant, standing with his arms around the woman who had fought by his side. The aftermath was swift and decisive. Croft and his men were taken into custody, their reign of intimidation in the valley brought to an abrupt and public end. The sheriff, after hearing the story from a proud and talkative Martha, looked at Alara with a newfound respect. The tale of the Eastern lady and the cast-iron skillet was already on its way to becoming a local legend. While the posse secured the prisoners and a bucket brigade was organized to fight the last of the barn fire, Alara led Caleb inside. She gently pushed him into a chair at the kitchen table, the same table where they had shared so many silent, awkward meals. The room was a wreck, a testament to the violence of the morning, but in its center, they created an island of quiet intimacy. She fetched the medical kit, her hands moving with a newfound confidence. As she carefully cut away his blood-soaked sleeve, the adrenaline that had sustained them both finally drained away, leaving them feeling raw, exhausted, and emotionally exposed. The bullet had passed clean through the fleshy part of his upper arm. It was a painful wound, but not a life-threatening one. "You were so brave," he said softly, watching her face as she cleaned the wound with carbolic acid. Her expression was a mixture of intense concentration and deep, tender concern. "I was terrified," she confessed, her voice barely a whisper. "But I was more terrified of losing you. We pointed his gun at you. I knew I could not just hide. I could not let him take you from me." He reached up with his good hand and cupped her cheek, his thumb gently stroking her skin. "You said you were stronger than I thought. You were right. I was a fool to ever doubt you." He looked at her, the woman who had not only breached the walls of his heart, but had stood and defended them with him. She was not a complication to his life. She was its missing piece. "Alara," he began, his voice serious, his gaze unwavering. "What I said before, I meant every word. But it was not a proper question." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "My grandmother, she left me a ring. It is just a simple gold band, nothing fancy. It is in a box upstairs, gathering dust, along with all the other things I put away from my past. I would like nothing more than to give it to you, to have it represent our future." His eyes searched hers, vulnerable and full of hope. "Alara Hayes, will you marry me? Will you make this house a home again and build a new life with me? Right here?" Tears, this time of pure, unadulterated joy, welled in her eyes and traced paths through the soot on her cheeks. She had come to this place with nothing, a victim of a cruel deception, only to find a truth more profound than any she could have imagined. She had found a home, not in a place, but in a person. "Yes," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Oh, Caleb," yes, he smiled, a true, soul-deep smile that transformed his rugged face, erasing the lines of grief and solitude. He leaned in and kissed her, a kiss that was not about passion or desperation, but about promise and belonging. It was a kiss that sealed the end of one life and the beginning of another. The news of their engagement spread through Redemption Creek like a prairie fire. The initial gossip about the mysterious Eastern woman staying at the Thorne Ranch was replaced by a wave of admiration and support. When Caleb and Alara came to town for supplies the following week, they were no longer a solitary man and a stranded woman, but a couple. They were greeted with handshakes, pats on the back, and warm smiles. The community, which had always kept a respectful distance from the grieving rancher, now opened its arms to embrace them both. A barn raising was organized, and men from all over the valley came to help Caleb rebuild, their hammers and saws a cheerful chorus of renewal. The women of the town, led by Martha, showered Alara with gifts of preserves, quilts, and homespun advice, welcoming her into their fold. Their union was not just a private commitment. It was a celebrated event, a symbol of hope and new beginnings for the entire valley. 2 years later, the harsh Wyoming sun, now softened by the golden light of late afternoon, streamed across the porch of the expanded ranch house. The new wing, built with timber from the mountains and the help of their neighbors, was a testament to the life that had grown there. Where once there had been only functional, hard-packed dirt, there was now a sprawling garden, a riot of color with roses, lavender, and sunflowers, all planted and tended by Alara's hand. The house was no longer a silent fortress against the world. It was a home, filled with the sounds of life and the scent of baking bread. Alara stood by the porch railing, a gentle breeze stirring the wisps of hair that had escaped her braid. She rested a hand on the gentle swell of her belly, where their second child grew, and watched the scene before her. On the patch of soft grass below the porch, a small boy with Caleb's dark, unruly hair and her own determined blue eyes took a few wobbly, triumphant steps before tumbling softly into the lawn. He pushed himself up, a delighted giggle bubbling from his lips, and looked to his father for approval. Caleb was there, kneeling in the grass, his hands outstretched. He was not the same man she had met on that dusty station platform. The guarded, haunted look in his eyes had been replaced by a deep and abiding contentment. The harsh lines on his face had been softened by laughter. He scooped up their son, Daniel, named in memory of the brother he would never know, and tossed him gently into the air. The boy's squeals of joy were the purest music Alara had ever heard. Caleb walked toward the porch, settling the boy on his hip. He came to stand behind Alara, his free arm wrapping around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. He was solid, warm, and real. He was her anchor and her harbor. He pressed a kiss to her temple, his lips brushing her skin. "He has your stubborn chin," Caleb murmured, his voice a low, contented rumble against her ear. "And your complete disregard for staying clean," she replied with a soft laugh, watching as young Daniel smeared a dusty hand across his father's clean shirt. They stood in comfortable silence for a long moment, watching their son explore a bright yellow butterfly that had landed on a sunflower. The world they had built together was peaceful, prosperous, and filled with a love so profound it felt like the very air they breathed. The ghosts of their separate pasts had not vanished, but they no longer haunted the present. They were memories, softened by time and integrated into the rich tapestry of their new life. "I promised I would fight for you," Caleb said quietly, his voice full of the memory of that terrible, wonderful dawn in the smoky kitchen. Alara turned in his arms to face him, her hands coming up to frame his face. She looked into his gray eyes, which now held all the love and devotion in the world, and her heart swelled with a gratitude so immense it almost hurt. She had fought, too. She had fought against her own fear, against the expectations of the world, and for the love of this good, strong man. "And I for you," she replied, her voice soft but sure. "Always." He lowered his head and kissed her, a slow, tender kiss filled with the quiet certainty of a shared future. They stood together on the porch of the home they had built from the ashes, their son playing at their feet, another life waiting to join them, all under the vast, benevolent watch of the Wyoming sky. They had found their redemption not in a place, but in each other.